So you mentioned that you are currently writing fairy tale villain retellings, and I'm curious, they're fairy tale historicals. So do you feel that because they're fairy tales, are you dealing with different like reader expectations or reader reception on this historical setting?
Little bit. So the larger focus of the story is that they're the villain retellings. And so I'm just taking the villain and then I'm just putting them in whatever historical time period that the fairy tale like initiated or took place in. And I'm just creating a story about a character that when you're done, essentially they could be that villain. So it's kind of far removed from the fairy tale itself. Some like run right up against where the fairy tale begins, right where my story kind of ends, but it is a the character themselves. They're not like the villain that you see in the fairy tale itself. It's a completely different crafted character. It's a story. It's not like a, like Disney fan fiction or anything, but it's this character, it's the story. But the historical comes in is that I'm trying to make sure that the world that I build for that fairy tale villain retelling is in a very historical sense. So, like in my Cinderella retelling, Before the Glass Slipper, it's in kind of around like late 16, early. I'm really kind of vague with the time because to me that's a little less important, but late 16, early 1700s France, kind of more rural France, not necessarily near Paris or anything. And so I kind of set up the time period and the setting and I paint the scene with that. The most recent book that I released for that is Before the Emerald Crown, which was actually took Disney's Brave and the Witch in the Woods archetype, which is one of my favorite literary archetypes. And I love that archetype. And I'm like, really? You have this old woman living by herself in the woods and she's automatically a witch? How is that like? Why is that always the case? And so that's the question I actually address in the book. And so I took that witch character from Brave and I just used it as like the launching point of how I found the character. And then I put her back 100 years. So we're talking like 800, 900 Scottish Highlands, and you have like clan conflict and you have clan rivalries, and it actually ends up very badly for her family, and so she has to kind of go stay with a family friend, and the family friend teaches her like what people think, like people leave you alone in the woods because they think you're like this crazy witch lady. And so it delves into those issues and then her trying to figure out like who she is and why she has magic. The biggest difference is that with my fairy tales, most of them have this magical element to them, of course. Before the Glass Slipper, not so much. There's a suggestion that the governess is maybe like the fairy godmother, but other than that, there's not a whole lot of magic leading into that one. But all the rest of them do. And magic isn't something that's really, in the Maiden of the Storm, we have like druids and there's references, but it's very down to earth, very kind of nature oriented, whereas this is actual real magic. And so if you're a historical romance reader, you don't love like magic or romantasy, obviously that's going to be an issue. If you want higher steam, if you want the romance to be the focus of the story, that's going to be an issue. But a lot of people like my historicals enough where they're like, I'll still read these even though they're low steam. They do have romance in them. So I have had some transition. They've been shockingly popular with the book talk community. So
Oh,
the romantasy element is really big over there. Yeah, if you romantasy and kind of dark romance are really big over there. So I've had a lot of people really kind of like the books and, ask about the books and reach out about the books over there, which was unexpected. It was
that's
unexpected.
great though. Do you think there's a villain that you wouldn't want to redeem in a story?
So at the end of the day, so the kind of the way I describe the books is that it's basically young person experiences trauma, young person tries to overcome trauma or or overcomes the trauma, young person finds agency, young person is now the villain. Like that's the structure. And then as you're reading it, like the reader is telling themselves, I would have done the same thing. I would have responded the same way. I would have had the same reaction. And then by the end of the book, they're like, I would have been the villain. Like I would have been. So I don't want to say necessarily it's a redeemable because I kind of take them out of that villain structure and I just make them a person. But I do have my list of, and there's some where it's like, I don't know if I'm going to get to that one. That one's going to be low down on my list for any number of reasons, like Aladdin with Jafar. Like I can see how his story would unfold, but there was a lot of kind of weird darkness there. It's also Middle Eastern, and I'm not like overly fluent with like their social structures and their culture. And there would be a lot of like sensitivity reading and beta reading going on with that. That's outside of my normal purview. I don't write Middle Eastern, and so I'd want to
Hmm.
make sure I did it correctly. And I wouldn't want to like do the like vilification at the end in the wrong way or anything like that. So ones like that where I'm like, I am not familiar with that culture. That's going to take a lot of extra steps for me to get there. I don't want to create a villain and then suddenly we have, you know, an issue that I didn't do it well. So some like
Mhm.
that I'm more hesitant towards, but I still have a whole story for Jafar. So
Yeah.
like in my head, like it's there. Like I have the
Yeah.
notes written out. So that's the only thing that would really be like stopping me. And then the tagline for those ones are villains aren't born, they're created, to kind of, get to the idea of, because at the end of the book, I mean, these, and the other thing with the fairy tales is they are not happy ever after. Like there's kind of a happy ending, but it's like you then know what happens next. And so it's not the happy ending, the happily ever after that we're used to or expect with historical romance or romance in general. So that is something to keep in mind. I tell my readers straight up, this is not a happily ever after like way you're used to with romances. So if that's important to you, keep that in mind as you're rolling into these books.
Yeah. Well, that's so interesting. And it's great that you've been able to explore these two different creative avenues from different historical romance eras to different romance subgenres to now these fairy tale retellings that aren't necessarily romances and don't necessarily have those same, they have a different sort of story that they're delivering.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely.